Captain Walter Briggs had a saying he repeated to every new co-pilot who climbed into his cockpit. There are two kinds of people in this world, pilots and passengers, and you, until I say otherwise, are still a passenger. For 41 years, nobody at Atlantic Crest Airways had dared correct him. He was the airline's most decorated captain, a man whose face hung in a framed portrait inside the training academy, a man whose name was whispered in flight schools across 3 continents. But on a freezing January morning at Chicago O'Hare, Walter Briggs was about to learn that the world had changed while he was busy admiring his own reflection. He was about to look at a young black woman in a first officer's uniform and snarl 6 words that would erase 41 years of legend in less than 41 seconds. "Get off my plane, affirmative action." He thought he was the king of the sky. He was about to find out he was standing in her house. Snow drifted past the floor-to-ceiling windows of Gate K-17, swirling around the wingtips of the Boeing 777 bound for Frankfurt. The terminal hummed with the low chaos of a winter morning, delayed flights, frustrated travelers wrapped in scarves, the muffled drone of overhead announcements. But inside the cockpit of Atlantic Crest Flight 411, the air was warm, dry, and saturated with the particular cologne Walter Briggs had worn since 1989. A heavy, woody scent that the cabin crew had learned to associate with stress and short tempers. Walter sat in the captain's chair, his polished black shoes propped against the rudder pedals, his uniform cap resting on his knee. At 61 years old, he looked like Hollywood had cast him for the role. Square jaw, deep-set blue eyes, a mane of white hair brushed back from a tan forehead, and the broad shoulders of a man who had once played college football before his draft number had pushed him into the Air Force instead. He'd flown F-15s over the Gulf, then KC-135 tankers, then 28 years of commercial wide-bodies. He had landed in monsoons, in sandstorms, on runways shorter than his patience. He believed, with the calm certainty of a man who had never been seriously contradicted, that the cockpit door was the boundary between the kingdom he ruled and the rabble he tolerated. A flight attendant named Marisol entered with his coffee. She was new, only 6 months on the line, and she had not yet learned the unwritten rules of the Briggs cockpit. She placed the cup on the center console rather than the side tray, and the lid wasn't sealed correctly. Walter looked at the cup, looked at her, and let the silence stretch until her smile collapsed. "Marisol," he said quietly, "do you know how many cockpit fires have started with an open coffee lid in the last decade?" I'm sorry, Captain." "I'll get a new one. Don't bother, just stand there for a moment and think about what I said." He let her stand for 5 full seconds before nodding her out. When the door clicked shut behind her, he allowed himself a small smile. Discipline. That was what was missing in this industry. Discipline was what kept airplanes in the sky and incompetence on the ground. He glanced at the clock on the overhead panel. 7:52. His first officer was assigned to be in the seat by 7:45, and the seat beside him was still empty. Walter felt the familiar tightening in his jaw. He pulled out his phone, scrolled to the crew roster, and frowned at the name listed for Flight 411, F.O. Imani Akafar. He didn't recognize it. He pulled up the internal directory and tapped through to the personnel photo. The image loaded slowly over the cockpit's anemic Wi-Fi. When it finally rendered, Walter Briggs stared at the screen for a long, frozen moment. The pilot scheduled to sit beside him for the next 9 hours over the North Atlantic was a young woman, perhaps 32, perhaps younger, with deep brown skin, intelligent eyes behind thin gold frames, and a calm, closed-mouth smile that the camera had failed to soften. Walter set the phone down on the console. He picked it back up. He looked at the photo again, as if hoping it might rearrange itself into someone he found acceptable. Then he reached for the cockpit interphone and pressed the button for the chief pilot's office. "Henderson," he said when the line picked up. "Briggs, there's a mistake on my roster for 411. They've put some girl named Akafar in my right seat. Send me Roberts or Conway, somebody who's actually flown the Atlantic in winter." There was a pause on the other end. "Walt, Akaffer is rated, she's typed on the 777 and she's been with us for 3 years. There's no mistake. 3 years, Walter scoffed. I've got socks older than her career, just fix it. He hung up before Henderson could respond. He took a slow sip of his coffee, which had gone cold while he wasn't looking, and he settled back into his chair. He had no idea that down the jet bridge, the woman he had just dismissed was walking toward him, and that her name was not the only thing he had gotten wrong. First Officer Imani Akaffer stepped through the security door at the end of the jet bridge and paused for a moment to brush the snow from the shoulders of her dark navy uniform. Outside, the storm had thickened into something the meteorologists were calling a clipper, a fast-moving system that would push down the lake and turn the runways into mirrors of black ice within the hour. She had flown through worse. She had landed a regional jet in Anchorage during a whiteout her second year out of flight school, and she had threaded a 737 between two thunderheads over Kansas City the summer she made captain on the narrow-body fleet. The weather did not worry her. The weather was honest. It told you exactly what it was going to do if you knew how to listen. What concerned her this morning was the voicemail she had received from the chief pilot's office at 6:15. Henderson's voice had been carefully neutral, the way it always was when something had already gone sideways. Imani, just a heads up. You're paired with Briggs today. He can be, well, you'll see, just keep it professional. He'll come around. She had played the voicemail twice in the Uber on the way to O'Hare. The second time she'd noticed the small pause before come around, the kind of pause that meant Henderson did not actually believe Briggs would. She straightened the cuffs of her jacket and ran a hand over her hair, which was pulled back into the same neat low bun she'd worn since the academy. She was 31 years old. She had 11,000 flight hours, 2 type ratings, a master's degree in aerospace engineering from Purdue, and a distinguished flying cross from her years in the Navy that she never mentioned in the office. None of those things, she suspected, would matter to Walter Briggs. He would see her face and decide what he had decided about her before she opened her mouth. She had been in the industry long enough to recognize the shape of that particular ceiling. She had also been in the industry long enough to know exactly how to crack it. She walked the length of the jet bridge with her flight bag rolling smoothly behind her, nodded to the gate agent at the aircraft door, and stepped over the threshold of the 777. The first officer's bag stowage was to the left, the cockpit door dead ahead. She paused outside the cockpit and adjusted her name tag, a small enameled rectangle that read simply FOI Akaffer in white lettering. She took a slow breath. Then she rapped twice on the door, the standard pre-entry knock, and pushed it open. The cologne hit her first, then the silence. Walter Briggs did not turn around. He sat in the captain's chair with his back to her, one hand resting on the throttle quadrant, the other holding his coffee cup. The set of his shoulders communicated everything before he spoke a word. She had seen that posture before. The deliberate refusal to acknowledge her existence, the calculated stillness designed to make her feel as if she had walked into a room where she was not invited. "Good morning, Captain," Imani said. Her voice was even, warm without being eager, the voice of a professional addressing another professional. First Officer Imani Akaffer reporting for Flight 411 to Frankfurt. Walter still did not turn. He took a long, slow sip of his coffee. He set the cup down with a small, audible click against the console. Then finally, he rotated his chair halfway toward her, just enough to look her up and down with an expression that suggested he had found something on the bottom of his shoe. "You're late." "I'm 7 minutes early, Captain." "You're 7 minutes early by your watch. In my cockpit, you're late." He turned back to the panel. "But that's the least of your problems. There's been a mix-up. Henderson is sending me a replacement. You can go back to the crew lounge and wait for your next assignment." Imani did not move. She had expected something like this, but the speed of it surprised her. They had not yet exchanged 10 sentences. He had not yet seen her credentials or asked about her ratings. He had simply looked at her and decided. "Captain Briggs, I just spoke with dispatch on my way down the jet bridge. My assignment to this flight is confirmed." "There is no replacement coming." Walter's jaw tightened visibly. "I just spoke with Henderson 5 minutes ago, sweetheart. Roberts is on his way." With respect, Captain, Roberts is in Dallas. I checked the duty roster myself before I left the hotel this morning. She kept her tone steady, almost gentle, the way you might speak to a man who was about to step into traffic without realizing it. I'm your first officer for this rotation. I'd like to stow my bag and begin the pre-flight if that's acceptable to you. Walter Briggs slowly set his coffee down. He turned the captain's chair the rest of the way around and stood up to his full height, and the cockpit suddenly felt very small. Walter Briggs was 6'3". In the cramped geometry of a cockpit, that height became a weapon. He had used it for 4 decades to remind co-pilots, gate agents, and the occasional dispatcher exactly where they stood in the hierarchy of his world. He stepped forward until he was close enough that Imani could smell the cold coffee on his breath, and he looked down at her with the patient contempt of a man explaining gravity to a child. "Let me make something very clear to you, sweetheart," Walter said. His voice was low, almost pleasant, the kind of low that traveled less than 3 feet and carried more menace than a shout. "I don't care what the duty roster says. I don't care what dispatch told you. I have been flying this airplane across this ocean since you were learning how to spell, and I am telling you that this seat, this airplane, and this flight belong to me, and I do not fly with affirmative action." The word landed in the cockpit like a small bomb. Imani did not flinch. She had been called worse by drunk passengers on commuter flights, by instructors at the academy who had once muttered things about her aggressive ambition, by a flight engineer in Bahrain who had asked if she was the cleaning lady. She had developed, over a decade of incidents, a kind of internal stillness. A place she went when men like Walter Briggs decided to show her who they were. "Captain Briggs," she said quietly, "I'd like you to think very carefully about what you just said to me." "I've thought about it for 41 years, Walter said. "I've watched this industry get gutted by quotas and slogans. I've watched standards drop so low you could trip over them. I've watched perfectly qualified men get passed over so the company could put a face on a brochure. I'm done being polite about it, so let me say it again slow so we don't have any confusion. Get off my plane." Imani held his gaze for a long moment. Then, without breaking eye contact, she reached into the inside pocket of her uniform jacket and pulled out her phone. She did not raise her voice. She did not step back. She simply unlocked the screen and opened her contacts. "What do you think you're doing?" Walter said. "I'm making a call, Captain." "To who?" "Your union rep." "Save the dues. By the time this story gets to a hearing, you'll already be flying out of some regional carrier in Mississippi." "Not my union rep," Imani said. She lifted the phone to her ear. "Excuse me, I need to step out of the cockpit to take this. I'll be back in 3 minutes. "You'll be back never," Walter snapped. "If you walk off this airplane, you don't come back on it." Imani gave him a small, polite smile that he would later, in the long, sleepless nights of his interrogation, remember as the most unsettling expression he had ever seen on another human face. Then she turned and walked back down the jet bridge. She didn't stop in the gate area. She kept walking until she found a quiet alcove near the wheelchair assistance desk, behind a row of unused boarding kiosks. She pressed a contact at the very top of her favorites. The line rang once. "Imani." The voice that answered was deep, calm, and unmistakable. It was the voice of Daniel Acaffer, chairman of the board of Atlantic Crest Airways. It was also the voice of her father. "Daddy," she said softly, and for the first time that morning her voice cracked just a fraction. She steadied it immediately. "We have a situation." "What kind of situation?" "Captain Walter Briggs, Flight 411 to Frankfurt. He just refused to fly with me. He used the phrase affirmative action. He told me to get off his airplane. There were no other crew members in the cockpit, but the cockpit voice recorder is already running for pre-flight checks. Everything he said is on tape." There was a silence on the other end of the line. When Daniel Acaffer spoke again, his voice had dropped to a register Imani had heard exactly 3 times in her life. Once when her grandmother died. Once when her younger brother was nearly killed in a car accident in college. And once, 14 years ago, when her father had announced at the dinner table that he was buying a controlling stake in a struggling American airline because no daughter of mine is going to spend her career being told to wait her turn. "Briggs," her father said. "I know that name, the portrait in the academy." "Yes." How long has he been with us? 41 years. He started before you bought the controlling interest. He's the most senior captain on the line. Not anymore. Daniel Akafor paused. Imani, listen to me. You have spent 4 years building yourself inside that company without using my name. You have earned every rating and every hour. The decision about what happens next is yours. Tell me what you want to do. Imani Akafor looked back down the jet bridge toward the cockpit where Walter Briggs was waiting to discover that the affirmative action hire he had just dismissed was the daughter of the man who signed his paychecks. I want to go back on that airplane, she said, and I want him to see exactly who he just threw off it. Daniel Akafor was quiet for a long moment, the way a chess master is quiet before he moves the piece that ends the game. Imani could hear him breathing, could picture him standing at the floor-to-ceiling window of his study in his Lake Forest home, looking out at the gray expanse of Lake Michigan, thinking 3 moves ahead the way he always did. Then we do this properly, her father said. I'm going to make 3 calls. The first is to Mei Lin Park, our chief operating officer. She lives 40 minutes from O'Hare. She will be at that gate inside an hour. The second is to legal. I want corporate counsel present when Briggs is removed because he will sue, and I want every word of his removal documented. The third is to the captain of the academy. I want Briggs's portrait off the wall by lunchtime before the press hears any of this. Daddy, I haven't asked you to escalate this all the way. You didn't have to, Daniel said. He didn't just insult my daughter. He insulted every black woman who has ever put on that uniform and every black woman who is watching to see whether she can put it on next. This is not personal, Imani. This is structural, and we are going to fix it in public. There's something else. Tell me. Imani lowered her voice further, glancing around the alcove. The corridor was empty except for a janitor wheeling a yellow mop bucket past the kiosks. I want to give him a chance to retract it. Why? Because if he doubles down with witnesses present, there is no defense, no misunderstanding, no edited video, no claim that I provoked him. I want him to say it again, loudly, in front of the cabin crew, in front of the lead flight attendant, in front of the gate agent if I can manage it. I want it on record 3 different ways so that when the union tries to wrap him in a procedural blanket, there is no blanket big enough. Her father made a small sound on the other end of the line that might have been a laugh. You did not get that from me. That is your mother talking. It might be. All right, play it your way. But Imani, listen carefully. The moment you feel unsafe, the moment that man puts a hand near you or starts shouting in a way that draws security, you walk off that airplane and you let Park handle the rest. He is twice your size and his career is collapsing whether he knows it yet or not. Cornered men do stupid things. I understand. I love you, Captain. First officer, Daddy. Not for much longer, Daniel Akafor said and hung up. Imani slid the phone back into her jacket pocket and stood for a moment with her eyes closed. She let herself feel it, the full weight of what was about to happen. 41 years of a man's career. A wife and probably children and grandchildren somewhere who would see his name on the news. A pension that would either survive or not depending on what crimes the next 90 minutes uncovered. She did not relish any of it. But she had also lived inside the consequence of men like Walter Briggs for too long to mistake mercy for justice. She had watched a friend at her last airline get washed out of the upgrade pool because a Czech airman decided she didn't have the temperament. She had watched a brilliant young dispatcher of Korean descent get passed over for promotion 3 times in favor of less qualified men who golfed with the right people. She had been told by a senior captain over drinks in Singapore that the only reason she had been hired was the optics. She had said nothing then. She was done saying nothing. She opened her eyes, smoothed the front of her uniform jacket, and walked back down the jet bridge. She found Walter Briggs not in the cockpit but standing in the forward galley, holding court. He had his uniform cap back on his head now, the 4 gold stripes on his shoulders catching the overhead light, and he was speaking to the lead flight attendant in the low, confidential tone of a man recruiting an ally. The flight attendant was a woman in her late 40s named Patricia Howell, a 30-year veteran of the airline who had flown with Walter dozens of times. Patricia's face was tight, her arms folded across her chest, and she was nodding the small, reluctant nods of someone who knew exactly what was being asked of her and did not want to give it. "All I'm saying, Patty," Walter was saying, "is that I have a bad feeling about this one. I've flown with a lot of people in 41 years. You develop an instinct, and my instinct is telling me she is not ready for an Atlantic crossing in winter weather. I'm not going to put your passengers at risk so the company can pat itself on the back. Are you with me on this?" Patricia's eyes flicked past Walter's shoulder and locked onto Imani standing in the galley doorway. The color drained from her face. "Captain Briggs," Imani said, "I'm back." Walter Briggs turned slowly, the smile he had been wearing for Patricia's benefit dying somewhere on the way around. He had assumed, with the casual certainty of a man whose assumptions had never been seriously inconvenienced, that Imani had gone to the crew lounge to weep into her phone, or perhaps to call her union rep, or to begin the long, humiliating walk back to wherever girls like her went when they were sent home. He had not expected her to return. The fact that she was standing in the galley doorway calm, composed, with her flight bag still rolling behind her like a small, obedient dog, was the first crack in the morning certainty. "What are you doing back here?" Walter said. "I'm reporting for my duty assignment, Captain. As I mentioned, dispatch confirmed the roster. There is no replacement coming. We have 312 passengers boarding in 40 minutes, and I would prefer that we resolve this professionally before they begin to file onto the aircraft." Patricia Howell had taken a half-step back, putting the beverage cart between herself and the two pilots. Her eyes were moving between them the way a tennis line judge follows a particularly fast volley. Walter, sensing his audience slipping, reached for the only tool he had ever needed: volume. "You don't tell me what we resolve, Missy. I told you to get off this airplane. I gave you a courtesy. You could have walked out of here and tomorrow morning we would all forget this happened. But no, you want to make a thing of it. Fine. Patty, you're a witness. I'm exercising my authority as captain of this aircraft under federal regulation to remove a crew member I deem unfit. I do not consider her ready for this crossing. I do not consider her trained adequately. I do not consider her, frankly, qualified to be in a cockpit at all. I will fly this airplane with a single pilot before I fly it with her." Patricia Howell's mouth opened. No sound came out. "Captain," Imani said, and her voice had not risen a single decibel, "I want to make sure I understand the basis for my removal. You stated earlier that you do not fly with affirmative action. Are you reiterating that position now, in front of Ms. Howell? You're putting words in my mouth." "I am quoting you, Captain, verbatim." The cockpit voice recorder caught the original statement. "I'm simply asking whether you stand by it." Walter's face flushed a deep, mottled red. He was not a stupid man. 41 years in the cockpit had taught him when an instrument was telling him something important. The small, calm voice of his first officer was telling him very clearly that he was being given an opportunity to walk back what he had said, and that if he did not take it, the consequences would be substantially worse than a delayed flight. A wiser man would have heard the warning. A humbler man would have taken the off-ramp. Walter Briggs was neither. "You know what?" he said, taking a step forward and jabbing a thick finger toward her chest. "Yes, I stand by it. I have watched this airline destroy itself for 15 years, putting unqualified diversity hires in seats that should have gone to men who earned them. I have buried friends, Patty, real pilots, men with thousands of hours who got pushed out so HR could fill a quota. I am 61 years old. I do not have time to babysit somebody's social experiment over the North Atlantic. So yes, affirmative action, diversity hire, whatever you want to call it, I will not fly with her. And if the company has a problem with that, the company can find a new captain for Flight 411. The galley was utterly silent. Even the small mechanical hum of the coffee maker seemed to have paused to listen. Patricia Howell had one hand pressed flat against her own chest. The two junior flight attendants who had drifted forward to see what the commotion was about had frozen halfway down the aisle. Imani took a small step forward, not a threatening step, a measured one, Thank you, Captain Briggs. I want you to know that I gave you that opportunity deliberately. I wanted to be certain. I am now certain. Certain of what? That the company will not have a problem finding a new captain for Flight 411. Walter laughed. It was a short, ugly bark of a laugh, the laugh of a man who could not yet see the shape of his own collapse. Oh, is that right? You're going to make sure I'm replaced, you. Sweetheart, I have more friends in this company than you have flight hours. The chief pilot is my fishing buddy. The director of operations was best man at my second wedding. You go ahead and file your little complaint. By the time it crosses anybody's desk, you'll be flying turboprops in Wichita. Captain, Imani said softly, my complaint is not going to cross anybody's desk. It is already on the desk of the only person whose opinion will matter. A new voice cut through the galley. Crisp, female, unfamiliar to Walter, and laced with the unmistakable authority of someone who had not asked permission to enter. Captain Briggs, step away from First Officer Acaffer. Now. The woman who had spoken was standing in the open aircraft door, snow still melting on the shoulders of her charcoal overcoat. She was perhaps 50 years old, slim, with the kind of posture that came from a lifetime of being underestimated and refusing to apologize for it. Her hair was cut short and silver at the temples. She wore no airline uniform, but the small enameled pin on her lapel, the gold and navy crest of Atlantic Crest Airways, identified her immediately to anyone who knew what to look for. Behind her stood a heavy-set man in a dark suit with a leather portfolio under one arm, and behind him, a uniformed gate agent who looked as if he had been swept along in the wake of something he did not yet understand. Walter Briggs squinted at her. He searched his memory for the face. He had been to enough company galas, enough holiday parties, enough corporate retreats at the Greenbrier that he should have recognized any executive who outranked him. He did not recognize this woman. That alone should have alarmed him. Instead, it made him bold. "And you are," Walter said, "Malin Park, Chief Operating Officer." She stepped fully into the forward cabin and let the door close behind her. The man with the portfolio followed. "I have been with the company for 6 years. We have met twice, at the safety summit in Denver and at the retirement dinner for Captain Holly's. You called me May both times and asked if I was someone's wife." Walter's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "This is Joseph Reyna," Malin continued, gesturing to the man behind her. "He is senior counsel for our employment practices group. He has been on the phone for the last 40 minutes with our outside firm. He is here to ensure that what happens in the next 10 minutes is documented in a manner that will withstand any subsequent legal proceeding. Mr. Reyna, please confirm that you are recording." "Recording," Joseph Reyna said, holding up a small black device. "Audio only, with consent of all parties present, per Illinois two-party consent statute." Captain Briggs, Ms. Howell, First Officer Acaffer, the junior attendants, Gate Agent Pendleton, please indicate verbal consent or decline. A small chorus of consents went around the galley. Walter said nothing. Joseph Reyna waited a beat, then made a quiet note. Captain Briggs declines to respond. Recording continues in single-party mode under recorder's own consent. Malin turned her full attention to Walter. Up close, her eyes were the color of dark coffee and entirely without warmth. "Captain Briggs, I have been briefed on the events of the last 20 minutes by 2 separate sources. First Officer Acaffer, who called immediately after leaving the cockpit, and the cockpit voice recorder, which dispatch has already pulled and forwarded to my office. I have heard the recording. I have heard the phrases affirmative action and diversity hire and social experiment used in reference to a fully rated first officer with over 11,000 flight hours. I have also just heard you, in this galley, repeat substantially similar statements in the presence of multiple witnesses. Is there anything you wish to add or clarify before I proceed?" Walter stared at her. The flush in his face had drained to a strange yellowish pallor. For the first time that morning, the practiced certainty in his eyes was beginning to flicker. I want my union rep present. I'm entitled to representation under the collective bargaining agreement before any disciplinary action." "You will have your representation," Malin said. "The union has already been notified. A representative is being driven from the downtown office. He will be present at the formal hearing. This is not the formal hearing. This is the emergency removal of a crew member who has, on tape, declared his intention to refuse to fly his assigned aircraft and has, on tape, expressed discriminatory animus toward his assigned first officer. Under Federal Aviation Regulation 121.535, the company retains authority over the assignment and removal of flight crew. You are being removed. The hearing will determine everything that follows. You can't just remove me. I'm the captain of this aircraft. You were the captain of this aircraft, Malin said. Effective 2 minutes ago, you are not. Captain Reginald Thompson is en route from the crew lounge. He will assume command of Flight 411. First Officer Acaffer will continue in her assigned position. The flight will depart on schedule. Walter looked around the galley. He looked at Patricia Howell, whose face had closed up entirely, the face of a woman who had spent 30 years learning when not to be in the room. He looked at the 2 junior flight attendants who were staring at him with the wide, unblinking eyes of people watching a building collapse. He looked at the gate agent. He looked, finally, at Imani Acaffer. She had not moved during the entire exchange. She was standing exactly where she had been standing when he had jabbed his finger toward her chest. Her hands were folded loosely in front of her. Her expression was neither triumphant nor angry. It was the calm, steady expression of a pilot watching a difficult landing come in exactly the way the instruments had predicted. Walter Briggs found to his horror that he was beginning to understand. "Who?" he said hoarsely. "Who is she?" Malin Park glanced at Imani. It was a small glance, deferential without being theatrical, the kind of glance a senior executive gives when she is silently asking permission. Imani gave the smallest nod in return. "First Officer Acaffer," Malin said, "would you like to answer the captain's question yourself?" Imani stepped forward. She did not raise her voice. She did not square her shoulders or lift her chin. She simply moved into the small open space at the center of the galley, and the geometry of the room rearranged itself around her the way it does around the person who is, finally, in charge. "My name is Imani Acaffer," she said. "I have 11,412 flight hours. I am type rated on the 737, the 757, the 767, and the 777. I am a graduate of the United States Naval Academy. I served 8 years as a naval aviator, including 3 combat deployments. I hold the Distinguished Flying Cross. I have a master's degree in aerospace engineering from Purdue University. I joined Atlantic Crest Airways 3 years ago as a first officer because I wanted to earn my command on the line, the way every captain in this airline has earned it. None of those things, Captain Briggs, are why you are being removed from this aircraft." She paused. The galley was so quiet that the small ticking of the cooling avionics behind the cockpit door was audible. "You are being removed because of what you said to me, and because of what you have, by your own statement, been saying to people like me for 15 years. I want you to understand that clearly because in the weeks ahead, you will be told a great many things about why this happened, and most of them will be lies. The reason is very simple. You looked at a fellow pilot and decided before she opened her mouth that she did not belong in your cockpit, and then you said it out loud, twice, in front of witnesses after being given a chance to take it back." Walter swallowed. His throat moved visibly. "But who," he said again, and his voice had thinned. "Who are you that this woman shows up, that legal shows up, that you have the COO on speed dial?" Imani looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached into her inside jacket pocket and pulled out a slim leather wallet. She opened it and held it up so that Walter could see what was inside. It was not an ID badge. It was a photograph. A family photograph, slightly creased at the edges, perhaps 10 years old. It showed a younger Imani, in her navy whites, standing beside an older man in a dark suit who had the same eyes and the same closed-mouth smile and the same calm, steady bearing. "My father is Daniel Acaffer," Imani said quietly. "He is the chairman of the board of Atlantic Crest Airways. He has held the controlling interest in this company for 14 years. He is the man who approved your last contract extension, Captain. He is also the man I called from the jet bridge 23 minutes ago." For a long moment, Walter Briggs did not appear to be breathing. His eyes had gone very wide and very still, the way a man's eyes go when he has been struck by something heavy and has not yet registered the pain. His lips moved silently around words that did not arrive. The galley around him seemed to recede, the metal walls bending inward, the overhead lights suddenly too bright. He reached out blindly for the edge of the beverage cart and missed. Then his knees went. He did not fall, exactly. It was more controlled than that, more like a building being demolished by men who knew what they were doing. His left knee touched the carpet first, then his right, and then he was kneeling in the forward galley of Atlantic Crest Flight 411, his captain's cap fallen sideways across his thigh, his hands open and empty at his sides, looking up at Imani Akafor with the face of a man who had just watched his entire life dismantle itself in the space of a single sentence. "Oh God," Walter whispered. Oh God, I didn't know. I didn't know who you were." "That," Imani said softly, "is precisely the problem. Please, Ms. Akafor, I have a family, I have a son in college, my daughter just had a baby, I have a mortgage I didn't mean it the way it sounded, it was the stress, it was the weather, I was worried about the crossing. I have been flying for 41 years, please." Imani did not move closer to him. She did not move away. She looked down at the kneeling man in the rumpled uniform, and she felt, very clearly, the absence of pleasure in this moment. There was no triumph in watching a 61-year-old man weep into the galley carpet. There was only the dull, steady recognition that this was what accountability actually looked like when it finally arrived, and that it was always uglier than the people demanding it had imagined. "Stand up, Captain Briggs," she said. Walter did not stand. He could not seem to find the mechanism in his own body that performed the action. Joseph Reyna stepped forward, took Walter gently by one elbow, and helped him to his feet with the practiced efficiency of a man who had attended to many such collapses in many such corporate galleys. Walter swayed once, steadied himself against the cart, and stood blinking at the carpet. "Captain Briggs," Malin Park said, her voice now stripped of the courtroom formality it had carried earlier, replaced with something quieter and more final. "You will exit the aircraft now. Mr. Reyna will accompany you to the gate office, where you will surrender your company identification, your aircraft keys, and your access credentials. You will be placed on administrative leave without pay, pending the outcome of a formal disciplinary hearing. You will not contact any current employee of this airline outside of your union representative and any counsel you choose to retain. Do you understand these instructions?" Walter nodded numbly. He did not look at Imani. He did not look at Patricia, or at the gate agent, or at the two junior flight attendants who had pressed themselves flat against the bulkhead to give him passage. He walked out of the galley with Joseph Reyna at his elbow, and as the aircraft door closed behind them, the entire forward cabin seemed to exhale at once. Patricia Howell sat down heavily on the jump seat. She put one hand over her mouth and held it there for a long moment. "Ms. Akafor," Patricia said finally. Her voice was uneven. "I have to apologize, I should have said something. He was already speaking about you before you came back to the galley. He was asking me to corroborate. He was trying to make me a witness for him, and I should have stopped him. I am so sorry." Imani looked at her. Patricia Howell was 51 years old. She had 3 grown children and a husband who worked in HVAC, and she had been flying the line since she was 22. Imani had read her personnel file on the way to the airport, the way she read the file of every senior crew member she was assigned to fly with. Patricia had 2 commendations for passenger care. She had never been written up. She had survived the carrier's 2 restructurings by keeping her head down and her opinions to herself, which was the same survival strategy that had let men like Walter Briggs flourish for 41 years. "Patricia," Imani said, "I want you to listen to me carefully. You did not corroborate him. You folded your arms and you did not nod when he wanted you to nod. You looked at me when I came back into the galley and you did not look away. That is not nothing. It is not enough, and we are both going to have to live with the fact that it is not enough, but it is not nothing. We are going to fly to Frankfurt today, and when we get back, you and I are going to have a long conversation about what changes." Patricia nodded. There were tears on her face that she did not seem to notice. "Yes, ma'am." "Captain," Imani said gently, "I'm a first officer." "Yes, ma'am," Patricia said again, and then she gave a small wet laugh and shook her head, and the worst of the tension in the galley broke at last. Maylin Park caught Imani's eye and gestured toward the cockpit. "Captain Thompson is 2 minutes out. He just cleared security. Are you ready to brief him on the flight plan?" "I am. I'll be in the gate office handling press inquiries. There are already 3 video clips circulating on social media: the aircraft door video, the jet bridge video, and a phone recording from a passenger in the gate area who heard the announcement that the captain had been replaced. By the time you reach Frankfurt, this story will be on every cable network on 3 continents. Are you prepared for that?" Imani considered. "Yes. Your father is preparing a statement for the 11 o'clock news cycle. He would like your approval on the language before it goes out. I will forward it to your company email before pushback. There is one phrase he wants you to weigh in on personally." "What phrase?" Maylin's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "He wants to know whether you would like the statement to confirm that you are his daughter, or whether you would prefer to maintain your professional anonymity for the remainder of your career on the line. He says it is your decision, and he will support either choice." Imani looked through the open doorway into the cockpit. The captain's seat sat empty, the leather still warm from Walter Briggs's 41 years of certainty. She thought about the 4 years she had spent inside this airline without using her father's name. She thought about the upgrade course she was scheduled to begin in March, the command check ride she would face in May, the left seat she had been planning to earn entirely on her own merit. She thought about the 1,000 small slights and dismissals that had punctuated her career, and about the 1,000 more that were waiting for the next young black woman who walked into a cockpit at this airline. She thought about visibility and the price of it and the price of refusing it. "Tell him to confirm it," she said. Maylin Park nodded once, the way a soldier acknowledges an order. "I'll send the statement now. It will be live by the time you reach cruise altitude." She paused at the aircraft door, one hand on the frame. "Imani, for what it is worth, I have wanted to say something to you in the hallways of headquarters every time I have passed you for the last 3 years. I knew who your father was. I never said a word because I understood why you were doing it the way you were doing it. I want you to know that I admired it, and I am sorry that this is how it ended." "It didn't end, Maylin," Imani said. "It started." Maylin smiled, a real smile this time, and stepped off the aircraft. The next 90 seconds belonged to Captain Reginald Thompson, who arrived in the forward galley slightly out of breath, with his uniform jacket only half-buttoned and his flight bag still trailing the white tag from the crew lounge. He was 63 years old, a quiet man with deep brown skin and gold-rimmed glasses, who had flown the line for 34 years and had never once made the company newsletter. He had been called out of the crew lounge with no explanation beyond get to gate K-17 in 3 minutes. He took one look at Imani, one look at the still slightly trembling cabin crew, and one look at the open and obviously vacated captain's seat, and the entire situation arranged itself in his head without a single word being exchanged. "First Officer Ackhaffer," he said. "Captain Reggie Thompson. I gather we have a flight to fly." "We do, Captain." "Then let's stop standing in the galley and go fly it." He stepped into the cockpit, slid into the left seat as if he had been born to it, and within 45 seconds had pulled out the flight plan, called for the pre-flight checklist, and begun the calm, orderly rhythm of preparing a wide-body for an Atlantic crossing. Imani slid into the right seat beside him. The cockpit smelled, faintly and unfortunately, of cold coffee and Walter Briggs's cologne. She cracked her side window for 30 seconds to let the winter air scrub it clean. "Pre-flight," Reggie said. "Pre-flight," Imani confirmed. They flew through the checklist with the easy precision of 2 professionals who had done this thousands of times in thousands of cockpits with thousands of different people. The boarding had been held during the incident. Now the gate agent began the careful work of explaining to 312 passengers that there had been a crew change, that the flight would be slightly delayed, and that they would receive vouchers for the inconvenience. The first passengers began to file aboard at 9:17. By 9:41, the cabin was full. By 9:53, the door was closed. At 10:04, Atlantic Crest Flight 411 pushed back from Gate K-17 into the falling snow. As they taxied toward runway 28R, Reggie glanced over at Imani. "You know," he said, "in 34 years on this airline, I have never once been called out of the lounge to replace a captain mid-boarding. Not for weather, not for sickness, not for anything. I know. I have, however, been called boy by a Czech airman in 1994, been told I was articulate by a chief pilot at my own promotion ceremony in 2002, and been asked by a passenger in 2009 whether I was really the captain or whether the white first officer was actually in charge. I have never said a word about any of it. I want to be clear with you about that, First Officer Akaffer. I have never said a word. I told myself I was being professional. I told myself I was choosing my battles. I told myself a great many things that I am beginning to suspect were just elegant words for being tired." Imani looked over at him. He was watching the taxiway lights, his hands relaxed on the tiller, the way a man flies who has stopped trying to prove anything to anyone. "You don't owe me an explanation, Captain Thompson. I'm not giving you one. I'm telling you that I watched the cockpit voice recording on my phone while I was walking to the gate. Malin forwarded it to every captain on the active roster about 10 minutes ago. I imagine your father's office instructed her to. And I want you to know that when we land in Frankfurt, I am going to ask for an appointment with the chief pilot, and I am going to tell him about 1994 and 2002 and 2009, and about the other things I have never told anybody. Because if a 31-year-old first officer can stand in a galley and let a man kneel in front of her without flinching, then a 63-year-old captain can sit in an HR office and tell the truth." Imani's throat tightened in a way she had not been expecting. She kept her eyes on the taxi chart in her lap and let the moment pass without speaking. Then, when she trusted her voice again, she said, "Flaps 5, Captain." "Flaps 5, Reggie said, and reached for the lever. The big aircraft turned onto the runway. The tower cleared them for takeoff, and Reggie pushed the throttles forward into the falling snow. The 777 climbed through the layers of gray and broke into clean sunlight at 26,000 feet. Below them, the cloud deck stretched flat and white to the horizon, hiding Chicago and the snow and the gate where Walter Briggs was, at that moment, surrendering his identification to a sympathetic but immovable HR representative. Above them, the sky was the deep blue of high altitude in winter, the kind of blue that pilots came to love more than any other color. Reggie engaged the autopilot at flight level 330. The cockpit settled into the long, quiet hum of cruise. Imani's phone, connected to the cockpit Wi-Fi, gave a soft chime. She glanced at the screen. Her father's statement had gone live at 11:07 Central Time. The headline on the first article she opened read, "Heiress to Atlantic Crest, Airways reveals identity after captain's racist refusal to fly." The second article, "Daniel Akaffer confirms daughter has worked anonymously as first officer for 4 years." The third, already accumulating thousands of comments, "Watch the moment a 41-year captain realizes he just refused to fly with the owner's daughter." She set the phone face down on the center console. There would be time for the internet later. There was always time for the internet. Walter Briggs's hearing convened 19 days later in a conference room at corporate headquarters. His union representative argued procedural defects, contractual protections, and the sanctity of 41 years of service. The company's counsel played the cockpit voice recording, the galley audio, and the testimony of 7 witnesses including Patricia Howell, whose composure broke twice during her statement but who did not, this time, fold her arms and look away. The hearing officer ruled within 4 hours. Walter Briggs was terminated for cause. His pension was preserved by a narrow vote of the trustees. who concluded that 41 years of service entitled him to the retirement he had earned, even if it did not entitle him to the dignity he had forfeited. He sold his house in suburban Naperville the following spring and moved to a small condominium in Phoenix, where he occasionally wrote long, unhappy posts on aviation forums under a screen name that everyone in the industry recognized within a week. The internal investigation that Daniel Acaffer commissioned in the wake of the incident lasted 7 months. It identified 63 current employees whose conduct, documented over years of suppressed complaints, fell below the standard the airline now intended to enforce. 41 of them were retrained. 14 were demoted. 8 were terminated. The chief pilot, who had been Walter's fishing buddy, retired at the end of the year with a quiet handshake and no farewell dinner. Patricia Howell was promoted to Director of Cabin Culture, a position created specifically for her, and she spent the next 3 years personally training every new flight attendant in the protocols that she had not, when it had counted, used herself. She kept a small framed photograph on her desk of the Flight 411 manifest from that January morning. People sometimes asked her why. She told them it was a reminder. Imani Acaffer completed her command upgrade in May. She did not, despite repeated suggestions from the corporate communications office, accept any of the magazine profiles, the morning show invitations, or the keynote slots she was offered. She gave exactly one interview to a small aviation journal published by a historically black college, in which she spoke for 45 minutes about crosswind landings and almost nothing about her father. She made captain on the 777 fleet by the end of the year. She flew the line. She kept her name on her uniform exactly as it had always been. Captain I. Acaffer. Captain Reggie Thompson did, in fact, schedule that meeting with the chief pilot when they landed in Frankfurt. He spoke for an hour and 20 minutes. He retired 2 years later on his own timeline, and at his retirement dinner he stood up and told the room about a 31-year-old first officer who had taught a 63-year-old captain that it was not too late to use his voice. The room gave him a standing ovation. Imani, sitting at a table near the back, did not stand. She was crying too hard to stand. Her father, sitting beside her, took her hand and held it and did not say anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said. The portrait of Walter Briggs came down from the wall of the training academy on the afternoon of January 11th. It was replaced, eventually, by a panel of 6 photographs of captains the airline had decided to honor for reasons other than seniority. Imani's photograph was not among them, at her insistence. She said she had not earned it yet. She said she would earn it on the line, the way every captain had earned it. And then she went back to flying airplanes across oceans, which was, in the end, what she had wanted all along. And that is the story of how one arrogant pilot dropped to his knees in a galley at O'Hare, and how the woman he ordered off his airplane became the captain who flew it home. What would you have done if you had been standing in that galley? Would you have spoken up, or would you have folded your arms and waited for someone else to do it? Tell me in the comments below. Hit the like button if this story moved you, subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one. Be the one who speaks. The sky belongs to all of us.